Every time I step into the operating room, I expect control, bright lights, sharp instruments, steady rhythm. But some nights, the OR turns into something else entirely, a place where silence is heavier than screams, and trust shatters under the knife. These are the moments that haunt me long after the incision is closed. Want to know what I found inside those patients that still keeps me awake at night? I've walked into the operating room thousands of times. Most days it feels like muscle memory: scrub, gown, gloves, the snap of latex, the cold steel instruments laid out in perfect rows. But there are nights when the lights feel too bright, when the air hums with something heavier than routine. Those are the nights that stay with you. The cases I can't forget, the ones that followed me home and crawled into my dreams. It always begins the same. A page from the ER, a patient with abdominal pain, a CT scan flashing shadows that don't quite make sense. You steel yourself, because surgery is supposed to be precision, order, control. But control is a fragile illusion. I've opened abdomens to find objects no human body should contain. Forks, glass shards wrapped in rags, things swallowed or pushed in, not by accident but with intention. The smell of infection rising like rot from the tissue. The silence in the OR when the team sees what UVA uncovered it's louder than any scream. We worked quickly, methodically, removing one object after another, but each item felt like a confession, a secret no one was meant to see. And in that silence, I remember thinking, what kind of pain drives someone to do this to themselves? That answer doesn't live in textbooks. It lingers long after the wound is closed. But nothing compares to the night I was called to operate on one of my own, a colleague, a surgeon I'd shared coffee with that very morning. Sudden perforation, free air in the abdomen, no time to hesitate. We prepped him like any other case. Same sterile drapes, same clipped commands. But when the nurse read his name aloud during timeout, the room went dead. I made the first incision, and the weight of it nearly broke me. Every clamp felt heavier. Every cut felt personal. I knew exactly what I was seeing, but this time the tissue belonged to a man who knew what it meant. A man who, if he survived, would remember every decision I made under those lights. We saved him. But afterward, washing blood from my hands, I realized I'd never look at my profession the same way again. Because sometimes the patient isn't just a patient. Sometimes it's someone who knows how fragile you really are. Not every case ends in survival. There are nights where, despite every ounce of skill, every drop of sweat, the body simply gives out. I've held clamps against vessels that crumbled in my hands, watched blood pressure spiral despite all the drugs we poured in, and then that flatline, that long, piercing tone that doesn't stop. We worked the code longer than we should have, refusing to accept it. But death comes anyway. You close the body, because even in death, dignity matters. And then comes the walk down the hall, the family waiting, faces rising with desperate hope when they see you. And you have to speak the words that break them. We did everything, but we couldn't save them. I've seen screams that tear through the walls. I've seen silence so heavy it bends the air. That moment telling them their world is gone haunts me more than any open chest or ruptured vessel. But perhaps the most chilling case was the one where the patient never truly slept. A routine heart procedure, a sternotomy, the saw buzzing through bone, anesthesia flowing, paralytic given, everything by the book. The monitors were steady, but then the heart rate rose, blood pressure climbed. We pushed more drugs, thinking it was pain, metabolism, something explainable. We pressed on. The surgery was completed, circulation restored, chest wired shut. But in recovery, the patient began to talk. They remembered the voices, the saw, the vibration of bone splitting. Worst of all, they remembered trying to scream, but being unable to move. They were awake inside a paralyzed body while we cut them open. The horror of that realization was indescribable. The anesthesiologist sat with them for hours, apologizing. But apologies don't erase the memory of being trapped inside your own flesh, watching your body betrayed. Even now, when I hear the saw start, I wonder if somewhere in that silence, a patient is listening. And then there was the mistake I'll carry forever. A sponge. Just one, left behind in the abdomen. The counts had been called correct. The incision closed. Weeks later, infection, abscess, a scan that revealed the truth. The shame is indescribable. Returning that patient to the OR felt like walking into a courtroom where the evidence was already stacked against me. Opening the wound, the smell of infection, the angry tissue clinging to that forgotten sponge, it was like facing a ghost of my own failure. I removed it, irrigated, repaired, and the patient survived. But survival doesn't erase betrayal. I sat across from them, explaining in plain words what happened. A sponge was left behind. We've removed it, but it should not have happened. There is no way to soften that. No way to rebuild trust once it's broken like that. From then on, every time I hear a nurse call out a count, my stomach knots, because I know what it means when the system fails. People think surgery is about skill, steady hands, and sharp minds. And yes, it is. But the truth is darker. Surgery is about trust. Every patient who goes under those lights gives us their body, their breath, their very consciousness. They give it freely, believing we will return it intact, and most of the time we do. But sometimes, despite everything, we don't. Sometimes we return them changed, scarred, traumatized. Sometimes we don't return them at all. These are the procedures that haunt me. Not the complex grafts, not the emergencies where blood floods the floor. It's the quiet ones. The foreign objects hidden in the bowel, the colleague under the drapes, the family waiting for news that will never be good, the patient who heard every word while paralyzed on the table, the sponge that never should have been left behind. These are the nights I drive home in silence. No music, no words, just the sound of the road and the weight of ghosts riding with me. Surgery isn't only about saving lives. Sometimes it's about carrying the ones you couldn't save, the mistakes you can't erase, the memories that will never leave you. That's the true horror of this work. And that's why when people ask me about the most terrifying procedures I've ever performed, I don't talk about blood or gore. I talk about the silence in the room when everyone realizes what's at stake. The silence when hope ends. The silence that follows me, long after the case is closed. I tell people surgery is order, light, steel, a choreography you can trust. But some nights the operating room feels like a trap. The doors click shut, the vents whisper, the monitors watch us back. Those are the nights that turn routine into a true hospital horror. The kind of operating room horror you don't see on TV. The kind of terrifying surgery stories you only hear from someone who stayed until the silence ended. It began with a spark, a tiny one electrocautery near an oxygen-rich field, a hiss, then flame, drapes curled like dry leaves. The anesthesiologist yelled. I covered the face first, smothered the fire with wet towels. Plastic melted. The smell of burned adhesive stuck to my throat. Alarms stacked on alarms. We cut power. We cut talk. Hands moved the way training drills them to move. But I could feel panic beating at the edges. We extinguished it in seconds. Seconds felt like hours. The patient lived. Minor burns. But when we resumed, the light felt wrong. Too bright. Too clean. The room had shown us how fast control dies. Another night, a young man, routine, athletic build, a simple repair, anesthesia said smooth induction, vitals perfect. Then the end-tidal CO climbed like a rocket, heart rate spiked, masseter rigidity, the skin flushed dark and hot, malignant hypothermia, rare, relentless. We called for pharmacy trays appeared like bricks of orange dust. Nurses mixed as if mixing time itself. Ice to axilla, ice to groin, cold saline. I could feel his heat on my gloved hands, a body cooking itself from the inside. We flooded him with the drug. The numbers slowed, then slowed more. He came back to safe. We finished in a room that stank of melted ice and fear. He woke up sore and confused. We told him the truth. He nodded. He didn't understand the part where we almost lost the clock. Once, we fought a transfusion reaction that should never have happened. Crossmatch said fine. Label said fine. The blood went in. 10 minutes later, he shivered. Urine turned T-dark. Pressure sagged. The line infiltrated and the truth spilled with it. Wrong unit, wrong patient name, printed one digit off. We stopped it. We flushed. Bicarbonate diuresis. ICU called by stared at the bag hanging heavy and red and suddenly obscene. We had followed the system. The system had blinked. He kept his kidneys. Barely. I remember signing the incident report with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. A never event is never theoretical when it sits there in a plastic bag. There was the storm, the kind that made the windows ache. Lightning rolled down the hallways. We were mixed case, liver bleeding, steady hands, steady rhythm, then darkness, not total. A smear of emergency light. The monitor died. The suction died. The ventilator went silent. For a second, no one moved. Then we did. Headlamps on, anesthesia bagged by hand. I called for clamps I couldn't TC and felt for planes like a blind person reading Braille. The backup generator coughed to life, then failed, then caught again. Every breath was counted. Every minute measured on a pulse felt at the wrist. Power returned in steps. First the monitor, then the suction, then the room. The hum came back like distant thunder. I finished the homeostasis and closed in a sweat that had nothing to do with effort. When I took off the headlamp, the imprint of the strap dug into my skin like a warning. Another time we were between floors with a heart and a cooler, donor organ, matched to a man who had worn a beeper for years, listening for salvation. The helicopter landed late. The window was tight. We sprinted with the organ, door to door, and then the elevator froze between floors and time froze with it. No cell service. No movement. We hit the button and hit it again. I looked at the perfusionist. He looked at me. We did math without speaking. Warm ischemic minutes. The kind that erase futures. I banged on the panel. Someone answered above us. Maintenance. A voice like gravel. We forced a reset. The car lurched. Doors opened to a floor we didn't need. We took the stairs, running with ice and hope. The O was ready when we burst through. We opened the chest like a book and made the anastomosis in silence. The donor heart took rhythm like it wanted the job. The room exhaled. I thought about a family somewhere else, in sudden grief, whose loss beat under my hand. I remember a laparoscopic case that turned on a breath. Routine gallbladder, CO insufflation, camera in, gentle sweep. Then the enter-dol CO fell. Oxygen saturation dipped. The heart stuttered. I heard the mill wheel murmur, that awful sound of air in the venous tree. Venous gas embolism. We dropped the head, turned the patient left. Aspiration through the central line. Anesthesia called out numbers, each one a cliff. The monitor flickered like a bad dream. I watched the heart's color, the liver's blush, and waited for the body to decide. Then, slowly, a pulse that made sense, a saturation that climbed. The mill wheel faded. We finished with hands that felt older. There was the night the instruments themselves became a ghost. Neurosurgery case. Nothing unusual at first. Weeks later, a call. Final pathology suggested prion disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob. The words landed like a weight on the sterile table. Prions don't respect sterilization the way bacteria do. Instruments were already cycled, racked with others. We quarantined the sets. We called everyone who had a reason to know. We charted lots, times, serial numbers. No one slept well. Nothing catastrophic happened. But for months, every tray I cracked felt like a question crawling out of stainless steel. Then, the child. Small, quiet. A belly that shouldn't have been that firm. The parents watched me with eyes that burned appendicitis, we thought. It was more necrotic bowel at the circumfriable, dark tissue that crumbled under forceps. I moved like I was learning to move again. No wasted motion. No extra words. We resected and joined what life we could. The anesthesiologist whispered numbers like prayers. The kid made it. In the recovery room, she reached for her mother's hand with an ived arm that trembled, and I felt something in my chest that wasn't medicine. Real-life horror isn't always blood. Sometimes it's a pink blanket folded too neatly at the foot of a hospital bed. Another night, I heard a sound and felt a freeze. A patient on the table. By Tosgood. The pulse oximeter beeped in rhythm. Then the capnography line flattened. Not a code. Not yet. The tube had kinked under the drape. Small, stupid, deadly if it stayed. We fixed it in seconds. The lungs inflated. The wave returned. And I stared at the green line and thought about how catastrophe sometimes hides inside trivia. These stories don't feel like stories when you're inside them. They feel like rooms you enter and have to find your way out of. Short steps, sharp choices. No guarantee. The OR smells like antiseptic and hot plastic and fear you're not supposed to show. The lights wipe out the world beyond the drapes. The only sky is a ceiling tile grid. The only weather is the ventilator's sigh. You listen, you act, you keep acting, you tell yourself you are steady, you lie a little, you have to. People ask for the scariest thing I've seen as a surgeon. They expect gore. They expect blood on the floor and instruments clattering and someone yelling stat. The truth is quieter. It's a flame that blooms in oxygen and eats paper in a breath. It's a heartbeat too fast for too long. It's a generator that decides to think about it. It's a numbered label that's wrong by one digit and almost ends a life. It's a heart in a cooler stuck between floors while the minutes turn to ash. It's the soft question in a parent's eyes before you answer. It's the whisper of a patient who says, "I heard you talking," and you know what that means. If you made it this far, you know. These are real surgeon experiences. True operating room horror, not fantasy, not fiction, unpredictable, atmospheric. The line between control and chaos is thin, and it cuts both ways. The operating room is supposed to be safe. Bright lights, sharp steel, hands trained to precision. But I've learned the OR is also a place where horror hides. Not supernatural horror, but the kind that lingers in silence, where trust breaks, and the body reveals something you can never unsee. One night they wheeled in a young woman, mid-20s, severe abdominal pain. CT showed a blockage. We expected adhesions, maybe a tumor. When I opened her belly, I froze. The intestines were packed tight with plastic bags. Dozens of them swallowed whole. The room went silent as we traced the loops. One wrong move and a bag could burst, spilling powder into her bloodstream. She'd be dead in minutes. I lifted each one with trembling care. The scrub nurse stopped breathing with me. We removed them all. She survived. But what stayed with me wasn't tea. The surgery, it was the realization she had carried death inside her body, hidden until we cut her open. Another time, an older man came in after a fall, fractured ribs, blood in the chest. We prepped him for thoracotomy. As I spread the ribs, I felt heat pour from the cavity. His lungs were shredded, but worse embedded in the tissue was something foreign. Sharp, rusted, a nail, multiple nails. We pulled them out, one by one, wrapped in coagulated blood. The team exchanged glances, but no one spoke. It wasn't an accident. Someone had done this to him when he woke. He refused to speak, just stared at the ceiling with eyes wide and unblinking. I still don't know the story behind those nails. That not knowing is what haunts me. There was the night anesthesia failed us. Middle-aged woman, routine hysterectomy. Induction seemed smooth. Paralytic given. The ventilator hummed. We made the first incision. That's when her heart rate spiked. Her blood pressure surged. We pushed more drugs. But then I saw it, her eyes, wet, darting under taped lids. She was awake while paralyzed, unable to scream, feeling everything. We slammed more anesthesia. The vitals calmed. But later, in recovery, she whispered, "I heard you talking. I felt the knife." She described the saw of the cautery, the tug of retraction. That case follows me into sleep, because the body healed, but the mind, I wonder if it ever will. Then there was the bleed. A young man in his 20s, car accident, torn liver, blood everywhere. We worked fast, clamping, suturing, packing, but every time I thought I had it, another vessel split open. The suction canister filled red, then another, then another. He slipped further with every minute. We transfused until the blood bank ran dry. The monitor flatlined. We coded him until our arms shook. Nothing. We closed the body, though there was no point. And then came the walk. Down the hall, family waiting. I sat with his parents and told them the words no one wants to hear. Their cries echoed louder than the alarms that had just faded. That's the sound that follows you home, not the flat. The sound of hope shattering in a waiting room. One of the worst nights wasn't death, but error. We finished a complex abdominal case. The count was correct, or so we thought. Weeks later, the patient came back with fever. CT revealed it. A sponge, left behind. Infection chewing through tissue. We brought him back to the OR, opened the wound, and there it was. Stinking soaked, proof of failure. Removing it felt like digging up guilt made solid. I faced his family and explained. Plain words. A sponge was left inside. We've removed it, but it should not have happened. They stared at me, betrayed. That shame lives under my skin. Every sponge counts since. I hear the ghost of that mistake. But the case that grips me most was the child. 8 years old. Small body, pale lips. Suspected appendicitis. Easy case. We opened. What I saw made my stomach twist. The appendix wasn't inflamed. The tissue around it was eaten away. Black necrotic. It spread deeper. A silent infection tearing through her abdomen. I worked fast, cutting away dead bowel, trying to salvage enough for survival. The anesthesiologist whispered numbers, each one dropping lower. We fought like hell, and somehow she made it off the table. She lived, but when I closed, I saw her mother's pink jacket folded on the chair by the OR door, and it hit me. I had cut death out of a child with minutes to spare. That image, the jacket waiting for someone who might not come back, is burned into me. People think the horror of surgery is blood. The truth is different. It's silence. The silence when we discover objects no body should hold. The silence when a colleague lies under your knife. The silence when anesthesia slips and someone feels everything. The silence in the waiting room before you speak the words that break a family. Those are the most terrifying procedures I've ever performed. They are scars I carry inside, deeper than any incision. And if you've listened this far, you understand. Surgery isn't just science. It's trust, fragile and fleeting. And when that trust breaks, It leaves wounds no suture can ever close. But the operating room is a place of ritual. Bright lights, steady hands, instruments shining like weapons of precision. People imagine it as pure science, order, control, but I've learned control as a lie. Under those lights I've seen things that don't belong in the human body. I've heard sounds that never leave you. I've felt terror rise in silence so heavy it drowned out the monitors. These are the procedures that cut deeper than skin. One night, the ER called a man in his 40s, abdominal pain, distended belly. CT showed what looked like fluid. We expected ascites, maybe a perforated ulcer. When I opened him, a wave of black liquid spilled over the drapes. It smelled of rot, metallic and sweet. My gloves slick with decay. I traced his bowel. Holes everywhere. Not one, but dozens, like someone had punched through his gut with nails. Each loop was leaking poison. It wasn't survivable. I knew it as soon as I saw it, but I still tried, clamping, resecting, suturing, fighting against a body that had already surrendered. He died on the table. We closed him anyway, because dignity matters even when life is gone. The memory of that black flood still creeps into my nose at night, a smell no amount of scrubbing ever erased. Another time, a patient came in after swallowing glass. Not shards from a bottle, long strips, sharpened edges, deliberate. We pulled them out one by one. Each one cut new tears as it slid free. The ore was silent except for the scrape of steel against steel as I dropped the pieces into a basin. When the last shard clinked down, the nurse looked at me with eyes wide and wet. We saved his life, but I kept thinking. He put this inside himself, knowing what it would do. We repaired the wounds, but nothing we did touched the reason he wanted to bleed from the inside out. That's the wound that no scalpel can reach. There was the night anesthesia betrayed us. Cardiac surgery. Routine stenotomy, we made the first cut, then the saw. The bone cracked open in clean lines. I thought the patient was under, but his blood pressure climbed, heart rate spiked, his eyes darted under tape. Later, in recovery, he told us everything. The sound of the saw, the pool of ritual, the voices. He said he tried to scream but his body wouldn't move, trapped inside his own skin. That confession sank like a stone in the room. We had cut him open while he lived every second of it. And though his chest healed, I know his mind never will. I'll never forget the time we lost power mid-surgery. It was storming, thunder rattling the windows. We were deep in an abdominal case, suction roaring, cautery hissing. Then, without warning, silence, darkness, except for dim emergency lights. The ventilator stopped. The monitors went black. For a second, the patient was just a body under a knife in the dark. We grabbed headlamps, handbagged oxygen. My hands shook as I sutured by flashlight. The backup generator groaned alive, but the minutes in the dark stretched like years. Every shadow looked like failure waiting. When power returned, the relief was sharp, but I still remember that choking quiet. The OR without machines felt like a tomb. And then the child, 8 years old, appendicitis, we thought. Simple. I opened, expecting a swollen appendix. Instead, necrotic tissue everywhere. The infection had eaten half her bowel. I cut fast, resecting, stapling, moving as if speed itself could buy her life. The anesthesiologist whispered, "She's slipping." Her pulse faded, skin pale as wax. I worked faster, hands trembling, not surgeon but desperate parent in that moment. We pulled her back, closed her belly with stitches so fine they looked like threads of light. She survived. But afterward I sat alone in the locker room, head in my hands, shaking because I had looked into that small body and seen death pressing its hands around her, waiting for me to miss a stitch. The worst wasn't blood or failure. It was error. A sponge. One left behind. We counted twice, and still it happened. Weeks later the patient returned, fever spiking, pus draining from the wound. The CT told the truth. A shadow we had left behind. I reopened the abdomen. The smell of infection filled the room. Angry tissue clung to the forgotten sponge, as if the body itself was screaming at us. I pulled it free, but I knew what it meant. Sitting across from that patient, I had to say the words, "A sponge was left inside you." We removed it, but it should not have happened. They stared at me with eyes hollowed by betrayal. That stare never left me. People think the horror of surgery is gore, the gush of blood, the crack of bone. They're wrong. The real horror is silence. The silence when the OR sees something nobody should hold. The silence when anesthesia fails and someone feels the knife. The silence when power dies and machines stop breathing. The silence in a waiting room, before you speak words that shatter a family. These are the most terrifying procedures I've performed. They live under my skin, stitched into me like scars. And every time I scrub in, every time the lights blaze down, I wonder if tonight will be another story, another ghost, another silence that never leaves. The operating room is supposed to be the safest place in the hospital. Bright lights, steady machines, sterile air that smells of antiseptic. But under those lights, I've seen things that will never leave me. Horror that doesn't come from ghosts, but from silence, mistakes, and the fragile thread of life snapping without warning. I still remember the boy, 12 years old. Football injury, they said. Just abdominal pain. His parents clutched each other in the waiting room, expecting a simple repair. But when I opened him, blood poured out, thick and black. A splenic rupture. His belly was a basin of death. We packed, clamped, transfused. Blood pressure rising, falling, vanishing. We cut faster than thought. Hands slick, clamps biting down. But the spleen shredded like wet paper. Every stitch tore free. Every second drained his future. We lost him. The silence afterward was unbearable. Closing a child's body after death is a ritual no surgeon forgets. When I told his parents, the scream that tore from his mother's chest echoed in my skull for months. Another night, an older woman. Her scan suggested obstruction. We opened and found something I wish I never had. Dozens of small metal objects, bent nails, screws, twisted wire. Her intestines punctured in places, tissue inflamed, infected. Each object lifted free like evidence from a crime scene. No one spoke. Not anesthesia, not the scrub nurse. Just the sound of metal hitting the basin, one piece at a time. Later I learned she had swallowed them herself, alone in her room. I stitched her back together, but the wound I couldn't touch was the one in her mind. The case that froze me came during a transplant, a donor liver, still pink and glistening in its tray. The recipient already prepped, chest and abdomen open. We had minutes, maybe less, before the organ began to die. Then the lights flickered, power gone, total blackness, except the emergency glow, faint and sickly. The ventilator cut, the suction died. The monitors went blind. The only sound left was the beeping of a failing backup battery. We bagged by hand, sweat dripping under our gowns, headlamps flickering like candles at a wake. I finished in anastomosis, by feel, fingertips reading vessels like braille. When the generator roared back to life, I almost collapsed from relief. But I'll never forget the sound of the ventilator stopping. It was like listening to a soul leave the body. Once we faced something darker than error, a simple appendectomy. A young woman, trembling, crying, pain, severe. The appendix was normal, too normal. Then I saw it. The uterus was torn. Not surgical, not accidental. Violence. The kind that leaves marks deeper than skin. We repaired the damage, but the silence in the room was suffocating. The scrub nurse turned away. The anesthesiologist muttered curses under his mask. We all knew what had happened, but the patient never spoke a word. Sometimes horror isn't what you cut out at S, what put you there in the first place. And then there was the night of the sponge, a failure that eats at me still. Routine abdominal case, counts called correct, closure neat. Weeks later, fever CT revealed the truth. The sponge sat there inside, soaked in infection, hidden in shadows. Removing it felt like confessing my own crime. I faced the family, told them plainly, a sponge was left inside. We've removed it, but it should never have happened. Their silence cut deeper than any scalpel. That silence still follows me. People imagine surgery is about skill, about cutting and stitching. But the truth is colder. Surgery is about trust. Patients give us everything, their body, their breath, their lives. And sometimes, despite our hands, despite our training, that trust shatters. That's the horror. Not blood, not bone, but silence. The silence in the OR when the monitors stop. The silence in recovery when a patient whispers, "I felt the knife." The silence in the waiting room before you break a family's heart. These are the most terrifying procedures I've performed. They left scars not on my hands, but on my conscience. And each time I scrub in, I wonder, will tonight be another ghost, another silence that never lets go. Every time I scrub in, I tell myself it's just another case, another incision, another repair. But some nights, the operating room feels like a trap. The lights glare too harshly, the air feels heavy, and every sound echoes as if the room itself is holding its breath. Those are the nights when horror crawls in. The nights I never forget. It started with a teenager, 17, healthy, strong. He collapsed in gym class. CT showed a ruptured aneurysm in his abdomen. We raced him to the OR. His blood poured faster than we could replace it. Suction roared, canisters filled, but every clamp slipped. Arteries tore like wet tissue. The floor was slick with red. His heart flatlined once, then again, and still we worked, hands moving in frantic rhythm. But when the silence came, the long, flat tone we knew, we closed his body in silence. And when I told his father, the man fell to his knees in the waiting room. His fists pounded the floor until blood came from his knuckles. That sound haunts me more than any monitor ever could. Another time, a prisoner brought in shackled guards at the door. He had swallowed razors, dozens, wrapped in thin paper that dissolved inside him. I opened his stomach and pulled them out one after another. The edges glinted under the lights, each one coated in blood. The basin filled with steel, the sound of it clinking like coins dropped in a well. The guards stared. The scrub nurse couldn't speak. We repaired the tears, but the silence in that room told me we weren't saving a man. We were patching a body so it could go back to its cage. There was the power failure. Thunder cracking outside, storm raging. We were mid-case, chest wide open. The saw still buzzing when the lights died. Darkness swallowed us, the ventilator silenced. For a second, the patient was nothing but a body under our knives, breath stolen by the storm. We switched to headlamps, bagged oxygen by hand. I felt for vessels with trembling fingers. No suction, no monitors, just instinct and blind hope. When the generator kicked back on, the relief was so sharp it felt like pain. But for those minutes I knew what it was to cut open flesh in the dark. Once anesthesia betrayed us, a woman in her 40s, a hysterectomy, routine induction smooth, paralytic given, vitals steady. We cut, then her heart rate surged. Blood pressure climbed, her eyes twitched beneath taped lids. Later, in recovery, she whispered, I felt everything. The saw, the cautery, the voices. She said she tried to scream, but couldn't move. Awake, paralyzed, cut open. That story still freezes me. Because we had done everything by the book, and still she lived through her own surgery. But the worst, a mistake, a sponge left behind. A simple abdominal surgery, count cord correct. We closed, documented, moved on. Weeks later, fever, infection. That silence crushed me harder than any lawsuit, harder than any death. And there was the child. Small, fragile, appendicitis, they said. But inside, necrotic bowel spreading like wildfire. I cut and resected, moving fast, the anesthesiologist whispering that her heart was slipping away. I stitched as if speed could buy her minutes. She lived, barely. When she woke, she reached for her mother's hand with an ived arm. That image nearly broke me, because I'd held her life like glass in my hands. One wrong move away from shattering. People think horror in surgery is blood. It isn't, it's silence. The silence when power dies. The silence when the monitors flatten. The silence in recovery when a patient tells you they felt the knife. The silence in the waiting room before you break a family's heart. That silence never leaves. These are the most terrifying procedures I've performed. They left scars not on my skin, but on my conscience. And every time I scrub in, I wonder, will tonight be another ghost? Another silence that cuts deeper than the scalpel. Thank you for listening. If these stories shook you, if they left you with chills, remember only a fraction of you are subscribed. Your support keeps these haunting tales alive. Subscribe, like, and share to keep the darkness spreading. And if